So I want to welcome the rabbis who are here for the Rabbinic Torah Seminar, for the Rabbinic Leadership Initiative, the fellows of the David Hartman Center, as well as folks who are here from the general public for this evening's annual Edward Bronfman Memorial Lecture. I want to start by thanking the members of the Bronfman family and offering a hope that what we speak about tonight constitutes a fitting tribute to the memory of Edward Bronfman. And I want to welcome all of you tonight to the Shalom Hartman Institute for an evening of conversation with Yossi Klein Halevi, which for us at the Institute, for whom Yossi is a Ben Bayit, a member of the Hartman Institute family, one of the pillars of this institution, I hope is both an evening of conversation about the ideas in your extraordinary book, Yossi, as well as an evening of celebration for you here at Machon Hartman for this incredible accomplishment.
Thank you very much.
I'm not going to give an extended introduction of Yossi. I think I would be unfair in his home territory. But many of you know his work as a journalist, an author, a writer. His recent book before this one, Like Dreamers, was a 10-year project and a tremendous lifelong accomplishment. The story really of the transformation of Israeli society since the Six-Day War through a close study of a number of characters who were paratroopers during the war. And of course, this newest book, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, a New York Times best-selling book, not a 10-year project, but maybe, as we'll talk about, also a lifelong project. But one of the things that I want to just say in the presence of so many people here before we get into some hard questions is to just, for me, you, Yossi, are not just the work that you do, but what's so powerful about about your writing and the commitment that you undertake is that, to me, you have become the beloved storyteller of the story of the Jewish people, whether through the story of the State of Israel or in many ways in this book. And I'll get this out of the way now. If you haven't bought it, please buy it. And if you have bought it, read it and recommend it to others. This is a story not just of the particular characters, as you did in Like Dreamers, but a story for many of us of what the story of the Jewish people in the State of Israel are about. So let me start by asking you, Yossi, why this book? Why now? What is it about this moment in history, in time, in the chronology of the State of Israel that precipitates writing this book? And in particular, this is called Letters to a Palestinian Neighbor, but it's in English, and you've spent a lot of time in America of late selling this book. And so I want to know why this book, why this story, and also why directed towards an English-speaking audience if you're speaking to Palestinians.
So first of all, good evening, everyone. And Yehuda, I don't know if you remember this, but when we were speaking about this evening, and you were suggesting all kinds of people to be sitting in that chair, and I kept saying, no, I actually want to do this with you. And I'm so glad that it is you and that we're doing this together, partly because of how much I've learned from you over the years. And you're really one of the people who has helped challenge me. And really, you've been such an important conversation partner and chavruta for me. And also what you've done with Hartman North America is, I think, quite simply an historic achievement. So thank you. So now to the easy part. Why this book? Why now? Why in America? Why in English? I should say that the book has been translated into Arabic. It is available for free downloading, but only in Arabic. And the purpose of the book really was to do what to my mind is so obvious, but has, again, as far as I know, has never been done before, and that is to simply tell our story to our neighbors. We tell our story to the American Congress. We tell our story to the media. There's an Israel advocacy organization that opened up an office in China, but we've never thought of actually addressing directly our Palestinian neighbors, and by extension, the Arab and Muslim worlds, and trying to explain who we are and what our story is, why we're here. And in terms of why I see that as really urgent. It's because I feel that one of the main obstacles, maybe the main obstacle, to a different kind of relationship between Israel and our neighbors is the inability, the refusal of most of the region to accept the legitimacy, the indigenousness of who we are. And I was speaking to one of the rabbis earlier, and he said to me, David Hartman said to me just before he died, I'm quoting this rabbi, that what I need to hear from our neighbors is that you are home. And if we hear those simple words, everything becomes possible. And we have yet to hear those words. So I've tried to write a book that explains why I came home. It's a personal book, but it isn't only a personal book. It's very much our story. It's about why we came home and why we believe that we came home. I got a letter a few weeks ago from a Jordanian who read the first letter of the book, which has come out in Arabic. We're putting the letters out in installments in Arabic because there's really this feeling that we need to let people in the region absorb these difficult letters. They are difficult letters I think for Palestinians, for Muslims to read. So this Jordanian writes me, he says, I'm not a Palestinian, but I still am your neighbor. I'm a bit of a farther removed neighbor. And he ends with the following words, and I'm quoting word for word. What the hell took you guys so long to finally begin explaining to us who you are and what you're about? And I almost felt that in future editions of the book, I would want to put that as the epigraph. Because that's really, for me, it's the question isn't why now, to some extent. It's really what took us so long to begin to try to tell our story.
So why in English, and why directed to, in many ways, an American audience?
Look, that same question is true really for all my books. My last book, which really should have been written in Hebrew, because it's very much an internal story, was written in English because, as we say in Hebrew, ma lasot, what can we do? I write better in English than I do in Hebrew, and in Arabic as well. And so that's my audience. That's how I think of these stories in English, and I'm an immigrant, and to some extent I'll always be an immigrant. And that's not necessarily a disadvantage. And I remember when I was writing Like Dreamers, one of the paratroopers, Arik Ahmon, said to me, you are a Yeled Chutz. You're an outsider. Yeled Chutz is a disparaging term that comes from the kibbutz movement. It means being an outsider child. And he says, you'll never get this story. You didn't fight in 67, and you didn't fight in 73, and you weren't there when Mapai split into 3 factions. And I said, you're right. I am a Yeled Chutz, but sometimes that's an advantage. Because sometimes an outsider who joins a society can see things that those who grew up in the society don't necessarily see. And maybe that's true as well for why did it take an American immigrant to write this book? Why hasn't a native-born Israeli written this book? And I don't have an answer. All I can say is that from the first day that I moved here, which was 35 years ago, in 1982, I've been struggling with this question of who are these people who are my neighbors, and what are we going to do? How is this going to work out? And I've never really heard a good answer, not from the left, not from the right. I always felt that each side in our political divide had certain blinders on and was not looking at the picture fully. The left was pretending that the denial of our story, of our narrative, is somehow a minor issue, on a minor obstacle on the way to peace, rather than, to my mind, being the main obstacle. And the right's blinders were equally obvious, that these are people who we could just treat as objects rather than as people who have their own national will. And so I was alienated from the beginning from the Israeli political conversation and always felt that I didn't have a home. Today, I feel much more at home here because I define myself as a centrist, and as a centrist who believes that we must have a two-state solution, but we can't have a two-state solution. And that's how, I think that many Israelis are at that place today. And so in a way, this book is really trying to express that mainstream Israeli perspective and explain that to Palestinians. As far as why in English, I would say candidly that I really had two audiences in mind. And it wasn't necessarily true when I began writing this book. Initially, I thought that I'd write two books. One book was to my Palestinian neighbor, and another book would be to a young American Jew. And a friend of mine, Rabbi John Moskowitz of Toronto, once said to me, I don't have, as a rabbi, he says, I don't have a short book, and he says, make it short, that I can give to an 18-year-old congregant who's about to go off to college. And that explains why Israel matters to us. And so I always had that as a challenge. And I really did feel that these were two separate books. And midway through writing this book to my Palestinian neighbor, it occurred to me that maybe the issues are not that different, that what I need to explain to my Palestinian neighbor might actually be similar to what I would need to say to an American Jew. And so I see this book coming out simultaneously in English and Arabic, and it came out in Arabic on the same day that it was released in English, and that was symbolically very important for me. I hope it'll come out soon in Hebrew. The question is, what's taking you so long to come out in Hebrew? And so I do hope that will happen as well.
So we'll come back to the two-state solution in a little bit. It's just striking to me, and then I want to ask you about some of the narrative components of the book. You know, in light of your previous comment of how important it is for you as an Israeli that the Palestinians recognize and understand our indigenousness, that it still takes an American Jewish immigrant to Israel who is not indigenous to be able to make the case for indigenousness. So there's something of a paradox. There's something of a paradox in that, of what is it about actually being indigenous here that is an obstacle to being able to see the indigenousness of the other and to actually build a relationship with
It's a wonderful insight, Yehuda. I think that part of the Israeli problem is that Israelis feel so naturally and profoundly indigenous that they don't even know how to explain it. And I think it takes an immigrant who re-indigenized himself here, and I certainly believe that that's what Aliyah is. It's that process of re-rooting yourself where certainly I belonged, personally, that it was the going through the process of re-indigenizing makes an immigrant particularly sensitive to the issue of do we belong here or not. And you know, my parents are buried here. My children were born here, and I feel myself no less indigenous than Israelis who are here for several generations. And I think that one of the arguments that I try to make in the book is that I came here not by my own steam. I didn't come here because this is a place that I wanted to. Of course I wanted to be here, but I was accepted here on the basis of repatriation, not on the basis of naturalization. And that really, I think, is the crucial point.
So let's talk about some of the core narratives that are in the book. And I want to push a little bit as it relates to some of these narratives as I struggled with it myself. On one hand, part of the premise of the book is I'm going to tell you my story. This is how I see myself. This is how I understand my story in the world. And you acknowledge that that there's going to be an implied reciprocity, that I'm capable of hearing your narrative as well, and that if we start talking to each other, talking about our indigeneity, our historical relationship, our crises, right? You use the language of Nakba in the book, which even just a few years ago in the context of the American Jewish community would have been thought of as, you don't say that, because that...
For me too.
Right, yes. That as though acknowledging someone else's narrative invalidates your own. So you do that effort. In particular, when you talk about the narratives of Oslo and the failures of Oslo, you had a line in which felt to me a little bit like a throwaway line, where you said, well, yes, Israel did continue to build settlements throughout the Oslo process, but from the perspective of a Palestinian narrative, that concession is the core of Palestinian rejection of Camp David. In other words, there's a certain point where these narratives, when the more honest we are about the narratives with each other, the more fundamentally incompatible these narratives become. So in what ways does telling narratives to the other actually advance the possibility of reconciliation? And to what ways does being fully transparent about that our stories are not compatible actually become an obstacle to the very reconciliation that you're trying to create?
My starting point in emphasizing narrative is that the well-intentioned diplomats who tried and failed for 20 or more years to solve this problem tried to circumvent the two-narrative problem and tried to deal, understandably, because that's what diplomats deal with, are the concrete issues, a line on the map, settlements, Jerusalem, the holy places. But when you try to avoid what I believe is the foundation of the conflict, which is these two conflicting narratives, these two stories, then in the end, those two narratives will come back to sabotage the process. And we have been in a 70-year war, more really. This war started, one can say, immediately after World War I. This is more or less the 100th anniversary of this war. And it is a war from the beginning of two conflicting narratives. Now, we tend to navigate that conflict in one of two ways, we Jews. One way is that we defend our narrative, and I'm a veteran of the narrative wars. I have been fighting the narrative wars as an op-ed writer in other ways, probably for 25 years. And the other way that we try to deal with the two-narrative problem, and this is more on parts of the left, is basically to say the Palestinians have a compelling narrative and to gradually, and this is a process that is gradually happening in parts of the left, to downplay or even entirely erase our narrative. And so what I've tried to do here is an experiment, and that's all it is. I would say that this book is an experiment. It is an attempt to model a possible conversation between an Israeli and whoever I find among Palestinians who are ready to have this conversation with me. And I have begun to find some very interesting interlocutors among the Palestinians. And I'm not looking for large numbers of people. This isn't a political movement. I'm a writer, and I'm just telling a story. And as you say, I'm inviting Palestinians to tell me their story. And the premise of this experiment is that we can begin to tell each other our stories without that leading to the usual shouting match and scoring points. I'm really trying to explain to Palestinians who I am. And I really want to hear from Palestinians who they are, how they experience this conflict, what their inherited memories are of this conflict. And it's a very tricky experiment. So I'll give you an example. I was in conversation with a Palestinian publicly in the US. I had about half a dozen public forums with Palestinians. And at one point he said, you talk about you were here 4,000 years. Well, we were here 6,000 years because we're descendants from the Canaanites. Now, at that moment, I thought the instinctive response as a veteran of the narrative wars was to say, come on. Don't start inventing the 6,000-year history.
Also, the world wasn't created 6,000 years ago. So it's like game over.
I should have used that argument. That's right. And then I just decided I'm going to leave it. Because right now, I'm not in the op-ed mode. I'm not an op-ed warrior at this moment. And I really need to own this process that I've invited my Palestinian neighbor to participate in, which is the trade-off is you will listen to my story and I'll listen to your story. Not that I'm going to convince you that my story was right. That's not going to happen. And my Palestinian neighbor will not convince me that their narrative is right. But what I am looking for is some way where if we ever do get back to the negotiating table, that there will be some space in the conversation where each side can say, for example, I understand that for you, all of this land from the river to the sea is Palestine. And you understand that for me, all of this land between the river and the sea is the land of Israel. Now what do we do with that? How does each side accommodate the claim of the other, the partial claim, in order to create an imperfect balance of justice where each claim can be honored in part? And the reason that I'm emphasizing that is because one of the points that I've tried to make in this book is that if we ever do get back to the negotiating table, the language needs to be different. The language needs to be not that we're trying to pretend that both sides don't have maximalist claims. And that really has been the premise, is that each side really understands the need for compromise and that partition is a good solution. And if you take the two narratives seriously, then you have to conclude that for both sides, partition is a terrible solution, because each side is going to be giving up something that it believes is deeply and essentially part of who they are. I feel that way about Judea and Samaria. And for me, it's not the West Bank, and it's certainly not occupied territory. And I need to say that to my Palestinian neighbor. And my starting point is exactly the same as the settlers, but that's not my end point. My end point is that I'm ready, under certain circumstances, to give up parts of what I believe belong to me, in the same way that I'm expecting a Palestinian to give up what they believe belongs to them. And that goes back to the whole question of narrative. Once you put the narrative at the center, you're creating a different framework for speaking about these issues, and possibly for trying to conceptually solve them.
So this is actually, I'm glad you moved this here, because this is, to me, I think the political crux of the book is what you call Zionist maximalism. It's a term you use in the book of taking seriously the legitimacy of our broadest possible claims to this land, and packaging that together with, we want to be claimants to this entire land, but we hope what that full claim results in is the capacity of getting towards partition, right? Using that language of kula sheli. If I only claim half of the garment, right, I'll wind up with a quarter. Whereas if I claim the whole garment and the other side claims the whole garment, then we can ultimately get to a place of splitting it. But this is why, although I understand the argument conceptually, I'm struggling with it in 2018. And the reason I struggle with it in 2018 is that there already is a school of thought that is Zionist maximalist, that doesn't believe in partition. And for the past 40 plus years, 50 plus years, they have been pursuing a policy of Zionist maximalism, creating the impossibility of territorial contiguity for a Palestinian state, making it unbelievably untenable to ultimately imagine the possibility of the partition that you're pushing for. And therefore, I wonder whether by arguing for this kind of Zionist maximalism and hoping that all of the Zionist maximalists will also believe in partition as a necessary component, what you're ultimately doing is licensing a political strategy that is doing everything possible to avoid partition. And I feel like ultimately I get stuck, and therefore that policy makes me gravitate towards, no, get out of the maximalist business, focus on partition, not because I don't have an emotional or sentimental attachment to those parts of the land of Israel that we ultimately would never be able to have under partition, but because attachment to that idea that it's mine becomes itself an obstacle to ever getting to the negotiated process that you want.
I think that was one of the rationales for when the Israeli left was initially strategizing about how to confront this issue is, let's not feed the maximalist appetite. We're now in the 51st year of ruling over another people. And we are so beyond that point. The maximalist vision has been played out in the most practical way possible. And so what I suppose, and I hadn't really thought this through, but I suppose that what I'm hoping to do in this book is to challenge the maximalists on their own ground for several reasons. First of all, because I come from there. I come from the right. I grew up in the Beitar youth movement, and it was funny when you were saying, Yehuda, that this is the most maximalist territorial claim that Jews can make. I grew up in a youth movement where I wore for years a necklace that had Jordan. I wore Jordan around my neck for my whole high school upbringing.
That is not a defense.
But so part of me emotionally, part of me feels, wait a minute, we've already given up so much territory. You want us to give up the other bank? It's like a bank run. Where it's like the end of both banks to the Jordan, where you don't even have one anymore. And I mean that not entirely as ironically. And that is that I feel the need to honor that maximalist claim, partly because I still identify, at least emotionally, if not politically, with that claim, partly because I believe it's true, and also because as a strategy, we are so beyond the point of thwarting the settlement project. And now the question is, how do we salvage at this very late hour the possibility of a two-state solution? And when you asked me earlier, your first question was, why now? One of the reasons for why I felt an urgency to put this book out now is because the possibility of a two-state solution is slipping away. And for many years, and you and I have talked about this for years, for many years I was among those Israelis, like our prime minister, who paid lip service to a two-state solution. Yes, we support a two-state solution in principle, but the other side is clearly not ready for it, and I believe that very strongly. I think if we were to create a Palestinian state tomorrow, it would almost certainly be taken over by Hamas, and then we would be surrounded on every border by terror enclaves. And nevertheless, between creating a two-state solution tomorrow and maintaining a status quo, which is an illusion because there is no status quo. The status quo is a cover for allowing that most determined element within Israeli society to change reality, and that's the settlement movement, and it's happening every day. What worries me now is that both sides are giving up even on paying lip service to a two-state solution. And sometimes lip service and hypocrisy is a very useful alternative to the raw truth. And what worries me even more is that the international community is starting to speak a language of one state. And I truly detest the two-state solution on so many levels. Again, from emotionally, the thought not only of giving up land that I believe is mine, but of dragging my fellow citizens out of homes that I believe, in principle, they have as much right to be in as I have. Well, I live in East Jerusalem, so I guess that's a problem too. But this sense of deep dread of actually reaching that moment of a two-state solution. But I have come to the point, and this is partly a result of our conversations, the conversations that we've had here over the years in our I Engage seminar, and is the realization that paying lip service to a two-state solution is no longer good enough, because we are reaching that point of no return, which my friends in the settlement movement will celebrate and see as a great victory. And I think that what they don't understand is that we will not necessarily have a one state based on their idea of what a one state will look like. which is that there's a right of return only for Jews. You have a one state, the pressure begins in earnest on Israel to open the door to right of return to Palestinians. Or, for example, the settlers and their supporters who say, we can have a one-state solution only with Gaza because we've already given, only with the West Bank because we've given Gaza back. Now, besides being unbelievably disingenuous, because this was the camp that fought tooth and nail against Sharon's withdrawal from Gaza, and now says, we're not in Gaza anymore, that means we can have a one-state with Judea and Samaria. Once you open the door to a one state, you're opening the door to bringing Gaza back into the picture as well. And so I feel this sense of urgency. Again, as somebody who really played that game all these years since the Second Intifada of, well, not yet, not yet, not yet. And between creating a two-state solution now and maintaining the status quo, there is a spectrum of possibilities. And I would really like to see Israel shift. I'd like to see our government shift direction so that we are moving toward an eventual, gradual two-state solution rather than moving toward a one-state solution, which is we are now. That, for me, is the political conversation, the debate that Israeli society does not want to have, that I did not want to have for years. But when you travel the world and you hear what the conversation is becoming about Israel, you realize this is a very dangerous moment for us.
So a place where we agree in terms of your criticism before of the language of status quo, because the status quo is not a status quo, it is the entrenchment of circumstances that support one political position, and then the establishment of that political position is having long-term legitimacy because the realities on the ground get changed. In fact, actually, status quoism, which is a kind of a political approach to this conflict, I find to be not just politically problematic in terms of not advancing a solution, but I find there's something anti-Zionist about it, right? Which is Zionism is the audacity of the Jewish people to look at political circumstances that everyone else would describe as being beyond our control, and actually taking responsibility in our own hands to transform a broken past into a totally different possible future. We did that. Look how great that was. And then you come to this conflict, and the attraction to status quoism feels anti-Zionist. And this is why I'm going to stay on the Zionist maximalism for a second. Why not take an approach which is totally different, which is, I know now's the time to start creating culture of emotional detachment from that maximalism. Let's prepare the conditions now for the detachment from that maximalism. Let's start figuring out a way to turn partition from b'diavad, the weaker scenario, to the ideal condition that would actually be the way in which we can live at peace in this country with other people. And what does a position of what you might call moral unilateralism look like? Where Israel begins to take responsibility, not that everything that it does vis-a-vis the Palestinians is a result of a negotiation, but says actually our treatment of the Palestinians is in our own self-interest and can actually take place through unilateral actions, even if it's not part of a bartered process.
No, I believe deeply in unilateralism up to a point. I think there is a point where unilateralism becomes reckless. But yes, and I like that phrase very much, moral unilateralism. We shouldn't forget that. It's a good one. And I feel that to adopt the approach that you're suggesting goes deeply against the culture in Israel today. In terms of an attachment to the land, the settlers have won that argument. And you see it among young Israelis. There is no green line psychologically. And the land of Israel and the state of Israel are conflated. So what I'm suggesting is, again, an experiment, which is to frankly embrace our maximalist claims, but as a starting point rather than the end point. And another reason for that is when you sit down, and you alluded to this, when you sit down with Palestinians, it's so obvious that from their side, it all belongs to them. And if we're ever going to reach an agreement, both sides need to feel that the other side has sacrificed something essential that belongs to them. And I need Palestinians to understand, whether or not they agree with this, but I need them to understand, I need the Arab world and the international community to understand that when I give up Judea and Samaria, I'm giving up something precious, something that is mine. In the same way that I'm going to have to accept the fact that when Palestinians make their peace with the state of Israel, they're giving up their claim to Yaffo and Haifa, which from their point of view is theirs, and I will accept their principle of their claim to all of this land, but I need them to understand that I have a claim to all of this land.
You know, one of the theories for the diminishing attachment to Israel by many American Jews is because many of us have embraced a largely Western Christian ethos around power, where the more powerful you are, the more morally vulnerable you are by definition, that power is fundamentally corrupting, and that the more vulnerable, the weaker party in a conflict stands on firmer moral ground. In your book, it seems to be that you're doing is trying to create a kind of flat surface. You have a narrative, I have a narrative. I ultimately want to create a kind of equality. But one of the things I couldn't help feeling as I was reading through the book, even a couple people said to me about the title, would your Palestinian neighbor think that they were your neighbor? Mm-hmm. Would they think that you thought of them as your neighbor? Mm-hmm. And is it possible to establish what you're trying to do on the basis of a deep power imbalance? In other words, in 1966, if this book is written, when both sides see themselves as profoundly vulnerable, in 1947, if this book is written pre-partition, you have a situation in which both parties are on flat ground. How do you account for the total power imbalance now that exists between Israel and the Palestinians, and whether it's possible to actually create the kind of flat ground that you're trying to create, or must something else happen from the Israeli side to enable Palestinians to feel that it's worth them sitting down as peers when they don't feel that they're actually your peers?
One of the disconnects in how Israelis and Palestinians, Middle Easterners generally, think about time and how Westerners think about time is in our relationship to history, in relationship to our story. And when you say that we felt vulnerable up until 1967, Israelis still carry a strong sense of vulnerability. And that's not victimhood. We have to make a clear distinction between vulnerability and victimhood. Israelis are not victims, do not feel victims. Israelis despise victimhood. It's another big disconnect between the Israeli psyche and much of the American Jewish approach to the Shoah, for example. The Israeli takeaway from the Shoah is this is never going to happen again to us. And the American Jewish takeaway is social justice. We navigate these issues very differently. And what that means really is, and again, that sense of vulnerability that we felt in the past has been continually replayed in different ways. It came out very strongly in the Second Intifada. I think the Second Intifada set us back psychologically by decades, and we have not recovered from the Second Intifada. We are in long-term post-traumatic Second Intifada stress, and so the balance of power. Yes, there's a balance of power, an imbalance of power in terms of practical power. Psychologically, it becomes a little more blurry. Palestinians are very aware of the fact that they're part of a region that has been hostile to Israel, that we are the minority. We are the only non-Arab, non-Muslim state in this region. Put another way, we are the only Middle East minority, and we are a Middle East minority, that has succeeded in empowering itself. And that's something that I think Israelis are very aware of. And I also believe Palestinians are very aware of it. I certainly know that Arab Israelis, Palestinian Israelis, are keenly aware of that power imbalance working in different ways. And the way that I put it in the book is that there's a kind of a split screen in the Israeli psyche. On one side of the screen, it's Israel versus the Palestinians, and we are Goliath. And on the other side of the screen, it's Israel and the Arab and Muslim worlds, and we are David. And so that tension is built into how Israelis experience this conflict. And if you're going to try to understand Israelis, and my appeal to my Palestinian neighbor, again, is don't indulge me, don't feel sorry for me, but understand me. Not for my sake, but for your sake. If you really want to reach an agreement with me, you're going to need to understand me in the way that I need to understand you. And so you need to understand that pressuring Israel and boycotting Israel and blowing up buses in Jerusalem doesn't work the way that you think it should work. It usually works in the opposite way. And the only embrace that, and this was proven by Sadat, the only embrace, the only pressure that Israelis can't resist is when we are welcomed, and when our legitimacy is not being challenged, and so that's what. And the fact that this conflict has been based on a denial of our legitimacy, of our right to exist, has pressed all of the deepest traumas in our psyche. And so to talk in the new campus language of power and power imbalance, it doesn't work here in the same way. And when you speak that language to Israelis, try explaining to a Jew whose parents or grandparents fled Iraq in 1951 that there's a power imbalance here. You know, we have an accumulation of memory. 70 years, and this is what I was trying to say earlier, 70 years in the Middle East is contemporary. We remember our vulnerability in 1948. We remember the expulsion from Arab countries. We remember what it was like when we didn't have an air force, when we had 4 second-hand Messerschmitts in 1948. And that is deeply a part of the Israeli psyche. And so I'm not trying to play that game with my neighbor. Well, you have this, we have this much going for us, you had this much in terms of the power imbalance. And I believe that on some level, we need to suspend that kind of language because it is not true to the way most Israelis experience this conflict.
One of the more surprising pieces of the book, which I think connects to some of your work here at the Institute, both as a Jewish think tank as well as the work that you've been doing with a Muslim Leadership Initiative and bridging between the Jewish community and the Muslim community in America in relationship to this conflict, is that it's a very Jewish book. In other words, what you describe as being telling the Israeli story is actually very much a Jewish book. It's built along the Jewish liturgical year. You make reference in the second chapter to Tisha B'Av. You end at Sukkot. The holidays serve as a kind of chronological markers through your conceptual story.
It's better that I started with Tisha B'Av and ended with Sukkot, right?
Yeah, it's better that way. Yeah, always good to start with Tisha B'Av, right? It has a redemptive aspiration in the book. So I want you to talk a little bit about that. Why is this such a heavily Jewish story? There are problematics with that, and in particular, one of the criticisms that we have endured with respect to the work that we do with Jews and Muslims in America around this conflict is that we are, by sleight of hand, shifting an ethnic national conflict between Palestinians and Israelis into a religious conflict between Jews and Muslims when it is from some vantage points not a religious conflict, and from other vantage points, like the argument is Jews and Muslims can get along perfectly great in all sorts of places. It's only when those religions are attached to nationalisms that they become not religions anymore and instead nationalism. So why is the Jewish piece so important to you in telling the story in this way, and how do you respond to that criticism?
when you sit down to write a book, especially a book about Israel and the conflict, you are keenly aware of the terrain, the literary terrain that's already been covered. And the question that's most urgent when you're starting out is, what will be different about this book? Why do we need yet another book about Israel and the conflict? And in one sense, this book is a response to some of the narratives that have been written in recent years about Israel and the conflict that have stripped Israel of its most basic Jewishness and deal with Israel from a very secular perspective. I couldn't write a book like that, first of all, because I am a religious Jew, and also because I feel that is increasingly false to what Israel has become. Israel today is not the Israel of the 40s and the 50s. In those years, I would say that the cultural war was defined, and I say this really only half ironically, as a struggle between the Israelis and the Jews. And what's happened in recent years is that the Jews won. There is no longer any question of the centrality of Judaism, Jewish identity, to Israeli identity. The open question is, what kind of Judaism? And one of the reasons that we sit in this place is that we believe that, we at Hartman believe that we have an opportunity, a once in 2,000 years opportunity to redefine Judaism from a place of self-confidence and sovereignty, rather than from the place of ghettoization and wariness toward a hostile outside world, and that we need to cultivate that opportunity. So I'm writing from that place that, first of all, reflects who I am personally, but also, and I think even more importantly, reflects the changes that have happened in Israeli society. And that's a story that has not been adequately told. In the book, I describe Zionism as the meeting point between need and longing. We have told the narrative of the Zionism of need, and everyone knows that story, and it begins with the pogroms in Russia and culminates in the Holocaust, but we have neglected the story of the Zionism of longing, which is this miraculous story of how the Jewish people managed to maintain a kind of vicarious indigenousness with the land that we lost but never forfeited. And that's a story that we no longer remember how to tell, even though that story has become much more central to Israeli culture, for example. Listen to Israeli music today. It's Jewish music. In a way, listen to Israeli music from 20, 30, 60 years ago. And Israeli music was always the carrier of the dream of a new secular Hebrew man. And today, Israeli music is the carrier of the re-Judaization of Israeli culture. So just to be true to Israel, I needed to tell this story in a religious way. To have a real conversation with a Palestinian neighbor, it cannot be a secular conversation. And what I've learned, you mentioned the Muslim Leadership Initiative, which is the program that we run here at Hartman for the last 5 years. It's an extraordinary program that brings groups of young emerging Muslim American leaders to Hartman, a Zionist institution in Jerusalem, to study Judaism, Israel, Jewish identity. We are about to host Cohort 5 starting on Sunday. It's their final seminar of the year. It's a year-long program. And I would like to introduce my partner in MLI, Imam Abdullah Antepli. Abdullah, if you would stand. Imam Abdullah heads Muslim affairs at Duke University. This is his initiative, and we opened the door. Abdullah came knocking, and we responded. And what MLI taught me, the Muslim Leadership Initiative, what I learned from day one with MLI was that a secular approach to Israel does not resonate for Muslims. It doesn't make sense. And Abdullah, if I can quote you, you said to me at the very beginning of MLI, you said, so let me get this straight. I was trying to explain secular Zionism to him. And he said, so secular Israelis say that the God they don't believe in gave them this land. And it is normative in the Muslim world, and if it's true among American Muslims, it's all the more true in the Middle East. It is normative to assume that the story of Israel begins with the Kishinev pogrom and ends in the Holocaust. And so by continuing to tell that 20th century narrative about Israel, we are inadvertently reinforcing the anti-Zionist argument in the Muslim world, which is to say that we don't have legitimacy, we don't have roots. And we need to start telling the story of that 2,000 years of vicarious religious attachment without downplaying the secular roots of Israel. I think that's crucial. This was a country that was founded primarily by former religious Jews in revolt against Judaism, and that is deeply part of who we are. And I'm very grateful that secularism is in the foundations of Israeli society. There's a built-in protection against the excesses of religion. But the secular dare, the secular conceit of the Zionist founders who believed that we could erase 4,000 years of Judaism has inevitably failed. And when you tell that story to Muslims, I'm not saying that you'll get people to agree with Zionism, but suddenly Zionism has a context that isn't just why is the Arab world, the Palestinians, paying the price for what Europe did to you? And then when you begin to explain, well, first of all, more than half the Jews in this country have family roots in countries where the Holocaust never happened, whose families moved from one part of the Middle East to another, and that much of that motivation was religious, and that you can understand Israel without understanding secularism on the one hand, but also without understanding these millennia of deep religious attachments to this land, then the conversation starts to shift. So we do ourselves a profound disservice by not telling the story that we all know and take for granted, but which the Muslim world does not know, does not understand. In terms of turning this conflict from a national into a religious conflict, I never believed that this was purely a national conflict, and I believe it far less today. And it's not only because of Hamas on the Palestinian side, it's because I think one of the failures, there were many reasons for the failures of Oslo, but one of the failures was that Oslo was an attempt to create peace between two secularized elites who attempted to circumvent the deep religious reservoirs among both peoples. And peace that doesn't have a religious imprimatur is not going to be legitimate in the Middle East. You can't create a Western peace here. And practically speaking, certainly since the Second Intifada, Benny Morris, the historian, argues that the primary motive of the Arab world's opposition to Zionism, going back before the state, and of the Palestinian national movement was always religious and never primarily national. Certainly today, you cannot understand the conflict without coming to terms with its deep religious roots. And I'll just give you one example. Something extraordinary happened in Jerusalem just recently, and that is what didn't happen. The embassy, the American embassy, was moved here, and Jerusalem survived. Jerusalem was almost completely quiet. And the demonstrations and riots on the Gaza border were not about Jerusalem. They were about the 70 years of Nakba. It was about return. It was about the refugees of 1948. It was not about the embassy. It became that through the media, but that was not the primary motive. But something about Jerusalem that's really I think worth pausing for a moment and saying, why didn't anything happen here? Why didn't the Palestinians in Jerusalem erupt? Now, I don't believe that most of the Palestinians here were indifferent or supported the move. But the only trigger that ever really results in serious violence in Jerusalem is if something happens on the Temple Mount. If the American embassy move to Jerusalem didn't trigger riots, then we need to really start paying closer attention to what this conflict really is about and what it is less about. And if it's not so much about the national elements, but if any slight change of the status quo on the Temple Mount, bringing metal detectors to the Temple Mount will lead to the most serious eruptions in Jerusalem that we had in years, and the embassy is passed over in silence, then I think we need to respect the depth of the religious element of this conflict.
One of my favorite lines in the book is in your discussion of the particular and the universal. You know, your book is about so many tensions and about so much, the seeking of so much balance. And in the discussion of the particular and the universal within Jewishness, you use the line, the danger of a peoplehood-based faith is self-obsession. All right, this reminds me of all people. You're going to love this, Yossi. It reminds me of a critique that Hannah Arendt gives to Golda Meir that she writes in her letter to Gershom Shalom, where Arendt says, in response to what Golda Meir had talked about her pride of being part of the Jewish people. I am a secularist, Golda Meir had said. I am secular, I don't believe in God, but I believe in the Jewish people. And Arendt's response to Golda Meir is, once upon a time, this people was so strong because it believed in God, it directed its attention towards God, and it was connected to each other because it believed in something bigger. Now this people believes only in itself. What good can come from that? It was an unbelievable response, and I heard a little bit of Hannah Arendt in you. So, mazel tov. I wanna ask. There is the reason why I was so taken by that is because it's unexpected, which is to say, so much of what calls itself the Israel story that is so worked up by why Jews are distanced from this story is because of a sense of a departure from Jewish peoplehood. That Jewish cultural, ideological creativity in America, for instance, that's not tethered to the story of Jewish peoplehood in the state of Israel is somehow a great betrayal, a great departure, a great violation. And I wonder whether we have to start embracing some of that, even if it comes at the cost of being pro-Israel, because it actually is a bulwark against peoplehood becoming a form of narcissism. Like, in what ways are you allowing within this framework for maybe a little bit less anxiety that being not so much Jewish peoplehood people is okay? Like, maybe that helps hold the state of Israel to remember for the state of Israel to remember that Jewish peoplehood is not just about loyalty to the people, but it's about the pursuit of something bigger, much more transcendent that we're supposed to be about.
My instinctive response to Hannah Arendt comes from my own personal background as the son of a Holocaust survivor, and I am hopelessly caught in a permanent obsession with the Holocaust. I recently realized that I probably think about the Holocaust several times a day, and not consciously, and I don't think it's necessarily a good thing, but that's just permanently shaped my worldview and my Jewish identity. And so my response to Arendt is that sometimes you have to, there are moments in history where a people just needs to accept dayenu. And so if after the Holocaust there are Jews who would affirm their pride in being Jewish, their attachment to a people that has been marked for disappearance, in the immediate aftermath of the Shoah, that is something to celebrate. And so that I think goes a long way toward accounting for why I believe that Jewish peoplehood is the starting point of our identity. And it's not how you express your peoplehood. It's not halakha. It isn't even Zionism. I say this as a former Beitari. Forgive me, my former colleagues and friends. But it is simply, if you identify as a Jew, for a post-Holocaust sensibility, that really is Dayenu. I would now begin to qualify that, not emotionally, because emotionally I think I will always be there, but beginning to look at the post-Holocaust era, which we are now in. We are no longer in the post-Holocaust era. I am, but we're not. And so what that means is that the instinctive attachment to the Jewish people as a response to the Shoah is no longer enough to sustain us in the way that it did for my parents' generation. And to that sense, I am a kind of a vicarious part of their generation. But most Jews today, fortunately, are not. And that means that mere instinctive Jewishness is no longer enough to carry the story in the way that it did for a generation or two after the Shoah. And that's extraordinary. And that was really one of the great achievements of secular Zionism, is that it came at precisely the moment when most Jews, I would argue, could no longer access genuine faith as a sustaining reason for being Jewish, and so had this alternative framework of peoplehood, of state. And in that sense, I see that I will never diminish the significance of a Jew like Golda Meir, who says, my attachment is to the state of Israel, or the land of Israel, or the people of Israel. That for me really has a form of sanctity to it. It's no longer enough. And that's something that I've certainly learned from you in our conversation over the years. And it's really where you've helped push me. And it's interesting that you're focusing on that line, because that is a line I would have never written 10 years ago. And that's really a Hartman line.
Let me ask one last question, then I'll open up to some questions from the audience, which is about the reception of this book in the American Jewish community. One of I feel my commitments of the work we're trying to do in America is to try to help American Jews stop weaponizing our institutional affiliations against each other, as though identifying with one group, going to one conference, defines us as Jews, because we think that our affiliations are an expression of Jewish peoplehood, but those affiliations and those institutions, those attachment to institutions, are actually becoming a way in which we attack one another. And one of the most powerful things, and we talked about this, was your keynoting at the J Street conference, which I know was not straightforward for you. It was not a space that you trusted or felt comfortable in, especially after the Iran deal. And you were received warmly. And I'm curious what you're making of the reception of this book in audiences that you would not have spoken in before, in some places where obviously you have spoken, in ways that I know some of the people who thought they were on your side politically are now not so sure. What is that experience of telling the story, of stretching yourself to tell the story as far as you've gone? What have you learned from that experience on the road?
Well, it's interesting. I went from the J Street convention to the RCA convention. The RCA is the Rabbinical Council of America, which is the Orthodox, modern, centrist Orthodox umbrella group. It is not J Street. It's a very different place. And I said the same thing in J Street that I said at the RCA, and I can't say that I was universally welcomed in either place, but I certainly found enough receptivity in both spaces that made me feel that maybe the American Jewish community is not as hopelessly polarized on Israel as it thinks it is. The book was warmly endorsed by both the foreword and commentary. And I was sure that both the foreword and commentary would hate the book, each for different reasons. And the reviews are very instructive, because you see that the reviewers didn't really want to like the book. and they're struggling with this. And it's also interesting to see what reservations each reviewer had about the book. And so what I learned about the American Jewish community I've been on the road for 3 months. I just got back a few days ago, and I really feel like I was running for office. It was city after city, and I feel that large parts of the American Jewish community are deeply frightened by where this schism is heading. And they're frightened by the general atmosphere in America. And of course you have your diehards who have already signed up for the take no prisoners politics of on either side. But I don't feel that a majority of American Jews are there. Admittedly, it's an anecdotal experience, it's subjective, but I spoke in the course of 3 months to probably thousands of people, and I felt a hunger for some new language about this conflict. And not only as a new language for us to conceive of our relationship with the Palestinians, but to conceive of our relationship with each other. And I think there is, among many Jews, a deep historical awareness, whether it's conscious or not, that 70 or 75 years after the Holocaust, this story cannot end in a historic Jewish schism. Because that's where we're heading, and we may already be, in some sense, we're already at the beginning of that process. And so I feel that we need, those of us who are rabbis here, those of us who are in public life, and this is certainly one of the main projects of the Institute, is to try to create spaces for Jews where we can speak about Israel and other issues that divide us in ways that don't lead to shouting matches, and that explore what are some of the common shared values, and this is very much Hartman language. What are the shared values that most normative Jews have in common over Israel? Well, we all want Israel to be secure. We all want Israel to be just. We all want Israel to be a majority Jewish. We all want Israel to have decent relations with the international community. How that plays out in our political understanding is where we are divided. But we are not essentially divided over what most Jews, I would argue, want for Israel. And so if I try to understand how it is that commentary and the forward responded favorably to my book, what I tried to do in the book, and I keep coming back to this expression of creating a new language. The language that I tried to create here, in terms of my conversation with a Palestinian neighbor, is to stretch my capacity for empathy without forfeiting the dignity of my narrative. And what tends to happen increasingly in the dysfunctional Jewish discourse over the Palestinians is that one part of the Jewish community is upholding our narrative without, and feeling that if we express any empathy for the Palestinians, that's in some ways betraying our story. And another part of the community that begins by apologizing. And you can never have a conversation with the other if you begin from the place of, I'm so sorry for everything we've done to you. That is not a healthy way to begin a conversation. You begin by saying, I have a story and you have a story, and this is my story. And so what I tried to do here is model that kind of conversation, but it isn't only a conversation between an Israeli and a Palestinian. It's potentially a conversation among Jews about how we have that conversation about Israel.
So let me open up and get a few questions from the audience, and I'm really will ask people to ask questions rather than to give speeches. We'll collect 3 or 4, and then we'll respond. Yes, sir.
Already forgotten the question.
You spoke at the beginning about receiving a letter from a Palestinian or from a Jordanian. Are you ever going to be speaking in majority Arab or Muslim setting?
Yep.
So starting with justice as a basic Palestinian approach to this conflict, I think you're right, and that's also one of the seminal issues of this conflict that many in the West haven't internalized. That it's not, a two-state solution is not enough. There needs to be this sense of justice, and I agree with you that for many Palestinians that means inflicting some punishment on Israel, or at least getting Israel to be on its knees symbolically and apologizing and saying this conflict was our fault. In the book, I do not use the word apology or sorry once. And it was in some of the earlier drafts, and I took it out. And one of the reasons for that was, well, first of all, the tone in the book was all wrong in previous drafts. I would go back and forth between anger and apology, which are the two ways in which the two Jewish camps speak to the Palestinians. And I was speaking to Palestinians in both of these modalities, and it was wrong. The tone was not right. And so what I feel is one of the reasons why I think it's so important to emphasize, and this goes back to what you were asking before, about why the maximalist Israeli claim needs to be emphasized, at least in principle, is because Palestinians have to understand that there are two claims to justice here. And that when we give up Judea and Samaria, we will be experiencing an injustice. And whether that satisfies the need for inflicting some sense of injustice on Israel among Palestinians or not, I think that needs to be a crucial psychological part of the process, is that both sides are giving up an essential part of their claim to justice. The second
question was about speaking in Arab and Muslim spaces.
Yeah. Let me preface my answer to the question about speaking in Arab majority or Muslim majority spaces by saying that I alluded to some letters that I've gotten in response to the book. And I've gotten a fair number of responses. Many of them were expected, expressions of, frankly, genocidal longings. And that was no surprise. What was surprising and very touching were responses, for example, like by a woman in Gaza, a young woman who wrote to me in Hebrew, saying she was a former journalist and that she's reading this book with the hope that it will give her hope. I've been invited to coffee all over the West Bank. I've begun getting substantive letters from some Palestinians. One young man who grew up in a refugee camp here near Bethlehem and now lives in the States, he went to the States to study, is actually writing a book in response called Letters to My Future Israeli Neighbor, because point that you raised earlier is that Palestinians do not regard themselves as our neighbors for all kinds of reasons, but one of the reasons is that, as this young man explains in one of his letters to me, is as long as you are occupying me, we can't consider ourselves neighbors, but I want to be your neighbor in the future. So he's writing a book. And the two letters that I've gotten so far are very interesting and very, very powerful. I would say that this is exactly the response that I was hoping to elicit, which is a very strong restating of the Palestinian narrative through his family experience, while at the same time acknowledging that Palestinians need to start struggling with, and he is struggling with this question, of the legitimacy of Israel. Not just that, well, you exist and we have to come to terms with you, which is what we've always heard from Palestinians who support a two-state solution, and I don't believe that that's good enough anymore. I need to start hearing Palestinians who are at least struggling with the question of legitimacy. So that's a preface to your question. I hope to get this book into spaces where I will be invited to speak, to engage. One of those spaces is the American Muslim community, and this is something Abdullah and I and others in our program are strategizing about, which is how do we get this book into Muslim American communities and start a conversation. I have spoken in some American mosques over the last few years, and I'm hoping to really turn that into a permanent part of my American speaking tours. In terms of the Middle East, I don't know if it's really sensible from a security point of view for an Israeli to be speaking in Palestinian spaces. I think it could be done in Jerusalem, certainly in Palestinian-Israeli spaces. And I'm hoping in parts of the Arab world that are beginning to rethink their relationship with Israel, thinking specifically of Saudi Arabia, of the Gulf states. I'm ready to go where I'm invited. And that also brings me back to an earlier question that you raised about why this moment. And I had mentioned the sense of urgency that I feel about the two-state solution, even as a possibility slipping away. But there's also a positive side to the urgency that I feel about renewing that conversation today, and that is that large parts of the Arab world are rethinking their relationship with us. And that is happening, of course, because of a shared fear of Iran, but it gives us the possibility, it gives us an opening to begin a conversation about our place in the region. What does it mean that the Jewish people has returned home? What do we mean by indigenousness? And so that's a conversation that I would love to have in Saudi Arabia. And 2 years ago, that was absolutely a fantasy. It was ludicrous to imagine that. Today, we just had, the American Jewish Committee had their annual global forum here in Jerusalem, and the head of the largest Muslim organization in the world, which is in Indonesia, came to Jerusalem and spoke at the AJC conference. Now, something is changing not only for the worse. The changes that are happening for the worse around us are evident every day. But something is also changing as a result of the disintegration of much of the Arab world and the rise of Iran. Something else is happening here. And what worries me, and this is also something that I would say I learned from you and Danielle and our other friends in our seminar, is that we need to be alert not only to danger, and I believe and this is the argument that I've had for years with the left, is that the left, to my understanding, the left continuously downplays the dangers that Israel faces. I think it's a fatal flaw in the approach of much of the left. But the fatal flaw on the right is to be blind to possibility, to sudden change, to openings. And I don't think that in the Middle East of 2018, where the Saudi media, which 2 or 3 years ago was among the most anti-Semitic state media in the world, and today has opened its pages to Israelis to be interviewed, even to write op-eds in government newspapers. I don't think that in 2018 Middle East, it's enough to only talk about Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas, but in addition to that, we need to talk about the openings that are possible.
The last comment was on 2 states, 1 homeland.
2 states, 1 homeland. I have a natural sympathy and affinity for their position. And what they basically say is that the 2 peoples are now so completely entwined and that the settlement movement is an irreversible fact. And just as there are Palestinians who are citizens of Israel, there are now Jews, Israelis, who will live permanently in Judea and Samaria. And what I like about this movement is that they combine insights from the left and the right. And I think that that's really creative thinking. I haven't yet seen from them a convincing blueprint for how we're actually going to manage to preserve a Jewish state and not become dissolved into what will, to my mind, inevitably turn into a one state. And so I'm not convinced, but I'm interested to continue that conversation. And it's certainly the most creative political thinking that we've seen here in a long time.
Yossi, one of the things that I am grateful for in your leadership and in your writing, and especially with this book, is the ways in which you put forward your ideas with profound conviction, with a strong belief of the places where you think you're right, that you know you're right, but with a deep interrogation of the self. So you tell us why you come to these conclusions, and you express through your writing and through the way you speak a tremendous love, not just for those who agree with you, but for those who are willing to talk to you. And I'm grateful for you for this book and for tonight. Thank you, Yossi.
Thanks so much, Yehuda. Thank you very much. Yes, that was by far.
Yeah, I agree. Yehuda, well done. Great to see you, buddy. You well?
Yeah, thank God.
You're making the rounds.
You?
Good. Things are great. I actually have a couple of questions for you. One, I might be able to be helpful. The first question is,